When you walk into a typical grocery store, and look down the aisles, you are immediately hit with this incredible illusion of infinite abundance.
Right, it feels completely engineering.
Exactly. You see Ukrainian wheat in the bread, American corn in the cereals, maybe rice imported from Southeast Asia. It feels like this massive, perfectly calibrated machine.
And because our food is pulled from so many different corners of the globe, you naturally assume the system is inherently resilient. We tell ourselves that, like, decentralization equals safety.
Yeah, like if a drought wipes out a crop in one hemisphere, another region simply steps in to fill the gap.
Precisely. That is the baseline assumption for modern global food security, but there's a massive blind spot there.
A huge one. Because roughly 70% of the world's phosphate rock, which is the absolutely essential, irreplaceable raw mineral required to make synthetic fertilizer, is controlled by one single country.
Yep.
And it's not the United States, it's not Russia, and it's not China, it is Morocco.
Which completely shatters that illusion of a decentralized food system. I mean, we spend a tremendous amount of time analyzing the geopolitics of grain, like who is planting wheat or shipping corn.
Right, but none of that grain grows without phosphorus.
None of it. In industrial agriculture, there is simply no synthetic substitute for it. You cannot engineer a replacement in a lab.
Wow. So you either have phosphate rock or you do not grow food at the scale required to sustain human populations.
Exactly, that's the stark reality.
Which means a nation of about 38 million people essentially holds the physical keys to feeding the other 8.2 billion of us. And that is the mission of today's deep dive.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We are unpacking the hidden, completely unavoidable bottleneck in the global food supply. And to figure out how we got here and what happens next, we've pulled together a fascinating stack of sources.
Yeah, we're looking at agricultural trade data, historical records, policy briefings, and some really complex geopolitical risk analyses.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand the sheer gravity of the power Morocco wields today, our sources suggest we actually need to look backwards.
We do. History is just full of ghosts when it comes to fertilizer monopolies.
Yeah.
The most striking parallel in our research actually goes back to 1864, centering on what was known as the Chincha Islands War.
And the crazy part about that conflict is they weren't fighting over gold or oil or land.
Yeah.
They were literally going to war over bird droppings.
Seabird guano, to be precise. Yeah.
Wow.
In the mid-19th century, guano was essentially the equivalent of modern phosphate rock. It was incredibly dense in the agricultural nutrients that European and American farmers were just desperate for at the time.
And Peru happened to control a series of islands off its coast that were essentially just mountains of this nutrient-rich guano.
Right, and Peru turned this into a massive economic engine. Those exports were so valuable, they ended up providing nearly 60% of the Peruvian government's total annual revenue.
Which is insane. But holding that much leverage naturally makes you a massive target.
It does. So in 1864, Spain simply sailed in and seized the islands.
Just took them.
And that single action, trying to forcibly control the flow of agricultural nutrients, sparked a multi-nation war involving Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia.
Because whoever controls the fertilizer controls the food supply.
Exactly. And whoever controls the food holds a lever of power that empires will bleed for. But foreign navies aren't the only threat to a fertilizer monopoly, right?
Right. Sometimes the danger is entirely internal. It's driven by short-term greed.
Yeah, and our sources point to the Pacific island of Nauru as the ultimate modern cautionary tale here.
Nauru is an island that essentially decided to consume itself.
It really did. Over the course of the 20th century, Nauru sat on an incredibly rich deposit of phosphate. But instead of managing it strategically, they just dug it out of the ground as fast as physically possible to sell on the global market.
And they ended up strip mining roughly 80% of their total land area, didn't they?
Yeah, 80%. They essentially turned their entire country into an open pit mine.
It's like tearing out the foundation of your house to buy incredibly expensive furniture. Like, eventually the house collapses.
That's a great way to put it. The cash influx was staggering at first, though. For a brief window in the 1970s, the citizens of Nauru boasted one of the highest per capita incomes on the entire planet.
But because it was a finite deposit being aggressively extracted, the rock eventually ran out.
Exactly. By the early 2010s, the industry had sharply declined. The physical island was environmentally devastated.
And today, the country is left fiscally dependent on selling fishing licenses and scraping together whatever residual phosphate revenue they can find.
It's a tragic boom and bust cycle.
Which begs a massive question. Morocco is currently sitting on the largest phosphate deposit on Earth. How did they avoid falling into that exact same Nauru trap and build something sustainable?
Well, they avoided it by fundamentally changing their relationship with the resource. Morocco learned that you cannot just be a quarry for the rest of the world.
Right.
Instead of just digging up raw dirt and loading it onto foreign ships, Morocco's state-owned enterprise, the OCP Group, built a vertically integrated empire.
They moved aggressively up the value chain.
Yes, exactly.
Wait, let me push back on that for a second. Digging rock out of the desert is relatively cheap and straightforward, right?
Sure.
But building the infrastructure to chemically process that rock into advanced agricultural products requires billions of dollars in capital, not to mention immense technological know-how. So how does a developing nation pull that off on a global scale?
By meticulously reinvesting their mining profits into heavy industrial infrastructure over decades. The mechanics of processing phosphate are actually incredibly complex.
I can imagine.
Yeah, first you have to wash the ore, which requires massive amounts of water. Then you have to build sprawling chemical plants that take raw sulfur, burn it to create sulfuric acid, and then react that highly corrosive acid with the crushed phosphate rock.
Oh, wow. So it's a pretty intense process.
It's very intense. That specific violent chemical reaction is what gives you phosphoric acid.
Right.
And then you have to take that acid and manufacture the actual finished granulated fertilizer products that a farmer in, say, Iowa or Brazil will actually put into their tractor.
So they aren't just selling the raw ingredient anymore. They own the entire recipe, from the ground to the farm.
What's fascinating here is how the data reveals the sheer dominance of that strategy. If we look at the OCP Group's market share in 2020, they controlled 34% of the global market for raw phosphate rock.
Which is already a massive share.
It is, but as you move up that value chain into the heavy chemistry we just talked about, their grip tightens. They control 54% of the global phosphoric acid market and 26% of finished phosphate fertilizers globally.
So they capture the profit margin at every single step of the industrial process.
Exactly.
And the financial returns on that strategy are accelerating. Our sources highlight OCP posting $5.45 billion in revenue just in the first half of 2025 alone.
Which is a 21% year-over-year increase.
That's huge. We're at a point where phosphate exports now make up roughly 20% of Morocco's total national export revenue.
Yeah, they have become the fourth largest fertilizer exporter in the world. They trail only Russia, China, and Canada, and they are the undisputed largest in Africa.
Which fundamentally shifts Morocco's posture on the global stage. I mean, Michael Tancham, a geopolitical analyst cited in our Middle East Institute briefing, argues this specific economic evolution positions Morocco as the literal gatekeeper of the world's food supply.
It's a heavy title, but it fits.
Just to make sure we are grasping the sheer scale of that phrase, does this essentially mean Morocco dictates the baseline cost of farming across the globe?
Functionally, yes. Because they hold 70% of the reserves and are a massive exporter of the finished chemical product, they operate as the world's marginal producer.
Meaning what, practically?
Well, if Morocco decides to expand capacity and flood the market, global food production costs stabilize. But if their production slows down for any reason, or if they decide to raise prices to increase revenue, every single farmer on Earth feels that pinch.
Because there is simply no other country with enough spare rock in the ground to make up the difference.
Exactly. Nobody else has the reserves to offset a Moroccan supply shock.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you have a monopoly with that much gravity, you start to see the world's largest superpowers forced into a corner.
Oh, absolutely. They have to react to Morocco's dominance.
And the sources show the United States and China handling this in completely opposite ways. The U.S. response has been, honestly, incredibly chaotic.
It really has been a masterclass in policy ping-pong. The volatility culminated on June 29, 2026, when President Trump actually had to declare a national emergency over the U.S. fertilizer supply.
Wait, really? A national emergency?
Yes, and he used that emergency declaration specifically to suspend U.S. tariffs on Moroccan phosphate for 8 months.
Invoking a national emergency just to pause a tariff is a massive move. Why were those tariffs in place to begin with? What were they actually trying to counter?
The mechanism in question is a countervailing duty. In 2021, the U.S. imposed a duty of 19.97% on Moroccan phosphate. Then, the U.S. reduced it to 2.12% in 2023, and then abruptly raised it back up to 16.8% in 2024. The underlying logic of a countervailing duty is to mathematically offset the financial advantages a foreign government gives to its own companies.
So American companies were arguing that Morocco wasn't playing fair.
Precisely. The Mosaic Company, which is the largest domestic producer of phosphate fertilizer in the U.S., petitioned the government for these duties.
What was their main argument?
Their core argument is that OCP, being state-owned by the Moroccan monarchy, operates with massive, unfair subsidies. Mosaic argued that OCP gets access to cheap state land, subsidized electricity, and preferential financing that an American corporation simply cannot compete with on the open market.
Okay, so our sources present two highly conflicting domestic realities here. And while we aren't here to pick a winner between American farmers and American fertilizer producers, you have to look at both sides to see why this policy became a crisis.
Right, you have to look at the whole picture.
On one hand, you have Mosaic demanding protection from subsidized foreign state monopolies. On the other hand, you have American farmers paying the bill for that protection.
And it was a hefty bill. A Texas A&M study we reviewed estimated that this back-and-forth tariff policy cost American crop producers $6.9 billion between 2021 and 2025.
Just by artificially driving up the cost of fertilizer.
Yep. And that tension is exactly why you saw the president of the National Corn Growers Association, Jed Bauer, publicly celebrating the June 2026 tariff suspension as desperately needed relief for struggling farmers.
But notice the ultimate outcome here. When the global supply chain tightened, and American farmers were facing catastrophic input costs, Washington did not go find a new source of phosphate to bypass Morocco.
They couldn't. The rock isn't there.
Right. They had to swallow their pride and suspend their own protective tariffs on the one supplier they simply couldn't do without. Now, contrast that chaotic American scramble with how China has positioned itself.
It's night and day. China's approach is entirely strategic and long-term. 2026 marks the 10th anniversary of the China-Morocco strategic partnership.
And to commemorate that milestone, Beijing introduced a sweeping zero-tariff policy on Moroccan goods entering the Chinese market.
Zero tariffs. And you can see the results of that open door in the trade volume immediately. Bilateral trade between China and Morocco hit nearly $11 billion in 2025.
We have a quote from Jawad Kardoudi, the president of the Moroccan Institute of International Relations, pointing out how this creates a mutually beneficial loop.
Yeah, Morocco gets a massive tariff-free market for its exports, and in return, China pulls massive amounts of capital and advanced technology into the North African region.
You step back and look at the board, and Morocco is executing an unbelievable geopolitical flex.
They really are.
They are successfully supplying the core agricultural needs of the United States, China, and Europe simultaneously. And despite the immense power of those global heavyweights, not a single one of them holds enough leverage to dictate terms to Morocco.
It is the ultimate advantage of holding a bottleneck resource. However, as brilliant as Morocco's vertical integration and diplomatic maneuvering have been, our sources make it very clear that this monopoly rests on some highly precarious foundations.
There are deep friction points.
Yes, friction points that, if ruptured, would instantly shake the global food supply.
Let's transition to those vulnerabilities, starting with the geopolitics of the actual desert, where this rock is being pulled out of the ground, because a significant chunk of these reserves lies in Western Sahara.
And this is where the geopolitics become incredibly dense. Western Sahara is a territory that Morocco has administered since 1975, but its sovereignty remains formally disputed under international law.
A very complex situation.
It is. There is a long-standing independence movement, and the international community has grappled with the territory's status for decades.
But the diplomatic consensus around that dispute is currently shifting, isn't it?
Drastically. In October 2025, the UN Security Council broke with decades of historical precedent. They officially endorsed Morocco's autonomy plan for Western Sahara, calling it the most feasible solution to the conflict.
That is a massive diplomatic victory for Morocco, effectively signaling international acceptance of their administration.
Absolutely.
But again, our sources present a totally conflicting reality on the ground that we need to examine. While the UN is shifting its political stance, international advocacy groups are raising massive red flags that are spooking global markets.
Right, like the Western Sahara Resource Watch, or WSRW, which published a highly critical report titled P for Plunder.
What's their main argument?
Their critique bypasses the UN's political maneuvering and anchors itself entirely in international law and human rights. WSRW argues that extracting phosphate from the Boucré mine, which is located in Western Sahara, constitutes the illegal exploitation of a non-self-governing territory.
Their core contention is that the immense wealth generated by this specific mine does not reach representative local institutions or benefit the indigenous population.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how terrified the global corporate market is of that critique.
Yeah, the WSRW report noted that in 2025, there were massive export volumes coming out of that specific mine, like over 2 million tons of phosphate rock worth nearly $376.5 million.
But why are corporate buyers fleeing? That's the question.
Right. If the rock is essential, why did the number of global companies willing to purchase from the Bucre mine plummet to a record low of just 3?
It comes down to the mechanics of modern corporate governance and reputational hazard. If a massive multinational agriculture firm buys rock sourced from a disputed territory, they risk becoming the target of global consumer boycotts.
And more importantly, they risk being blacklisted by massive ESG funds, right? Environmental, social, and governance investment funds.
Exactly. Billions of dollars in investment capital will flee a company if they are formally accused of plundering resources from a non-self-governing territory. So companies simply stop buying from that specific mine to protect their stock prices.
So Morocco has immense geopolitical leverage, but every ton of rock that leaves that specific mine carries a radioactive reputational shadow.
Yes, but there is a second major vulnerability in this system, and it has absolutely nothing to do with international law or ESG funds. It is entirely physical.
We have to talk about water.
We do.
Earlier, you broke down the mechanics of turning rock into acid and how that requires washing the ore and running massive chemical plants. But Morocco is fundamentally a water-scarce nation.
Very much so.
Currently, the phosphate sector consumes roughly 7% of the entire country's energy output and a full 1% of its national water supply. That seems like a terrifying vulnerability.
It is.
Oh, they have the rock, but if they run out of the water needed to process it, the whole system grinds to a halt.
That is the ultimate physical ceiling of this entire global monopoly. There's no negotiating with a drought. If water scarcity in North Africa forces OCP to slow down their chemical washing and processing, their export capacity shrinks. If Morocco's export capacity shrinks, global fertilizer supplies tighten overnight and global food prices instantly spike.
Wow.
It is a harsh physical constraint that no amount of geopolitical maneuvering and no UN Security Council resolution can bypass.
Which brings this massive abstract geopolitical puzzle right back down to your daily life. Because if you are listening to this, there is no plan C for global phosphate.
There really isn't.
If that U.S. tariff suspension snaps back into place when it expires in February 2027, or if a severe drought in North Africa slows down Moroccan production, it won't just be some distant headline in a foreign policy journal.
No, it won't.
It will show up very quietly but very clearly as a higher number on your grocery store receipt.
So what does this all mean? This raises an important question, and it's one that forces us to look past the immediate geopolitics of tariffs and trade deals. We know, as a scientific fact, that phosphorus has absolutely no synthetic substitute in agriculture. We also know, from looking at the tragic history of Nauru, that island-sized deposits, no matter how unimaginably rich they seem, eventually run out completely.
Right.
So if we take that localized reality and extrapolate it to the entire globe, well, what happens to the 8.2 billion of us? Not if politics shut the gate or if water scarcity slows the line, but when the global geological lottery simply runs out of rock in the distant future. Are we fundamentally eating our way through a finite stone?
It makes you look at that grocery store aisle a whole lot differently, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
That perfectly engineered illusion of infinite abundance, all resting on a single, finite rock in the desert. Well, that is all we have for you today on this deep dive. Thank you so much for exploring these sources with us, and we will catch you next time.